Vous avez des places libres devant.
There's still seats available toward the front of the room. It's warm up in the front, and there are spotlights here.
Bonjour à toutes. Bonjour.
Good morning to you, one and all. Thank you for spending a part of the morning with us, in spite of the fact there's some competition in the Paris financial market right now with results. With Christian, the customary exercise, and of course you'll have an opportunity to ask all your questions because we've got the entire executive committee with us present in the room today, including Jocelyne. She's over there, Jocelyne, our new HR manager who came on board exactly 3 weeks ago. First of all, since it's always more fun this way, let's look at some pictures. This is the Salvador de Bahia airport. Just to get you interested, whet your appetite, and motivate you to go there. It's an airport. We won this one, you'll remember. We upgraded it, extended it. We raised the environmental parameters in terms of waste processing, water processing, in many different areas, improvements. In a record time, this was emphasized by the Brazilian authorities, for that matter. President Bolsonaro was to come to the inauguration, but unfortunately he had a slight health problem, so the transport minister attended the inauguration in his stead. That was only possible because Vinci Airport was highly mobilized on the subject, of course, but also because they were supported by synergy with a Brazilian subsidiary that's very familiar with Brazil, therefore. They clustered together with a builder from Portugal, making it possible to really hit the ground running and do the whole CapEx operation in a record time. The second slide we look at here is an illustration of one of the components, not the only component necessarily, of the low-carbon motorway concept, which Vinci Autoroutes is rolling out now. You can see on this line here, this is a carpool parking lot, so people can meet up in the parking lot near the motorway before then carpooling it to their destinations. Then we have a funny picture. Interesting one. This is in Saskatchewan. There's a story about Saskatchewan. When you lose your dog, you can follow it for 48 hours. You can watch it 48 hours. Everything's so flat, you can watch it walking away. It was very cold. You can see how cold it was here. You see the tents and so forth. We got a speech in a language we weren't familiar with by the Native American Indian chief. He had a cigarette packet in his hand, which was a symbol of peace, and he also lit some peace candles for this opening. What was also very nice was the Prime Minister of Saskatchewan, after the speeches and ribbon cutting, then took the wheel of this tractor trailer, the truck you see at the front here, and he actually drove that truck himself. Try to imagine that happening here. And he led the procession that way. Next, an illustration of Vinci Energy's involvement in the area of producing renewable energy. This is solar energy here we're seeing, of course. An interesting picture. This is an innovation. Next picture here. Innovation by Eurovia. It's a robot, so an automated autonomous vehicle that can therefore very safely do horizontal markings or road marking on motorway or highway sections. The next slide here, this picture I hope is meaningful to you. This is the end of the civil engineering work of the amazing ITR project in France. Very much internationally financed. This is the first stage in a very ambitious program designed to develop energy from nuclear fusion, which would mean on Earth to reproduce the mechanism that's taking place on the face of the sun. This project, ITER, should begin generating power in 2025-ish. If all works out, it would run for around 10 years. Then they'd perfect a first series, more industrial-type series of facility using the technique based on Einstein's E equals mc squared, and the first series then could come online midway through this century, if this works out as what's seen in laboratory observations, then it would mean mankind would have energy available to it that would be almost limitless using fusion, which means transforming material into energy. It's colossal. It's amazing. It's happening in France. It's an international cooperation. It's a real first in this area. There are tens of billions involved here. We're working together with other European businesses here, and we've been involved in the civil engineering for this flagship project that we'll be hearing about in upcoming decades. Another beautiful example here of Vinci Immobilier's know-how. This is a project near the La Défense Ring Road. It's a building that we bought, and then we completely restructured, refurbished it, also revamped the energy facilities here, and then we sold it. So those are just a few illustrations of things we worked on in 2019. 2019 was a good year, a very good year, in fact. First of all, we saw solid growth. We'll delve into some detail. Growth in business and in order intake. That gives us a good visibility at the beginning of 2020. We had good motorway traffic. I'll come back to the point. Still very good airport traffic as well. All this leads to the following slide. Operating income and net income, which are up strongly. And this is very good news in recent weeks of fiscal 19. Excellent free cash flow, up by around 1 billion compared to what we saw in free cash flow in 2018. Christian, of course, will come back to the point in greater detail, as well as coming in on the other figures. But beyond these economic results, we have to emphasize the major work that was done in all of our divisions and business lines throughout 2019, enabling us a few weeks ago to take the commitment to reduce by 40% our CO2 emissions, our scopes. We're in control of scopes 1 and 2. CO2 emissions will be cutting by 40% by 2030, which brings us right in line with COP21, which means a trajectory whereby it can reduce the increase of the temperature by the end of the century by under 2 degrees. All of our geographies are seeing growth. That's fairly infrequent. You see Europe's doing well, especially France. France is almost all organic growth, boosted in France by activities in the region around Paris, the Greater Paris Project, plus all the other property operations, more or less thanks to Greater Paris. But also we'd say that, once again, we have a large number of towers, office towers being built and some being completed, particularly in the La Défense neighborhood. Another highlight, strong growth in North America. Of course, this is the full year effect of acquisitions that we made in 2018, especially Vinci Energy, Prime Line, and Eurovia, taking over activities from plant and paving, the Lane Construction Company. Something we said to you a year ago, we could tell Africa was very much resuming growth. We saw this in order intakes in 2018. This is further confirmed. Activity on the African continent up by almost 20% in 2019. Further detail, French motorways, heavy vehicle traffic resumed well in the last few weeks of the year. To some degree, this was expected, but some of it was unexpected, but had been expected. We knew that the baseline effect from December 2018 was extremely low because there had been some social unrest that took place back then, you can recall, throughout the country, and particularly in the motorway networks. But something that was less expected was the carryover effect due to the railway strikes that led more traffic, more users to the motorways than we'd expected. So all in all, this is why we were able to come out with a good 2019, or save 2019, so to speak. But also been some other parameters that impacted the bad weather and then the heat wave and so forth for many different reasons. Up until the very last weeks of 2019, the year hadn't been on the trajectory of growth of 2.8%. Another highlight under Vinci Autoroutes, work on the Strasbourg bypass, which is going forward apace. Also explaining why Vinci Autoroutes capex for 2019 reaching 800 million euros. This includes the capex for the major infrastructure, the Strasbourg bypass, which should be completed during 2021. And then more daily considerations, Vinci Autoroute. A lot of work being done to prepare for new uses, prepare the infrastructure for that usage, such as autonomous mobility, connected and shared mobility. Also infrastructures that are fostering carpooling, I alluded to that earlier, plus working on developing AI bases and digital services such as the Ulys concept that you all have on your iPhones, such as the multimodal comparator or the mobility assistant. Vinci Autoroutes also launched a new concept, which is ABC, low carbon motorway. The idea is to reduce the impact of the motorway, for instance, by using separate carpool lanes and transport lanes, and also by developing a whole offer of non-carbon recharging stations throughout the highway network. By way of illustration, currently we have around 250 recharging stations throughout our Vinci Autoroutes network. Very quickly this will be ramped up to 400 recharging stations. This will mean, if you calculate this, there'll be recharge station for electric vehicles approximately every some 80 kilometers, and this will help motivate people to actually use an electric vehicle to decide whether it's cost-effective for them to buy an electric vehicle. They will know they'll be able to travel to another country and find a recharge station whenever they need one, especially if they're using the Vinci Autoroute motorway system. This will also mean we'll be able to produce our own electricity carbon-free for the fueling of these stations. So we have programs and projects to roll out solar panels to the various unused motorway spaces. This is land next to our motorway networks, but is not actually used as such for lanes, and we can therefore place other things on that land, such as installing facilities for renewable energy. Vinci Airports continues to be dynamic. Without going through all the percentages of growth, just a couple of figures nonetheless. 6.9% growth in Portugal. In Portugal, we manage 60 million passengers, 8% in France, driven by good performance in Lyon and Nantes. 5.7% growth in Chile, that's good. Over 7% growth in Japan. We're now managing via our airport platform there 50 million passengers in Japan. 9.2% growth in Belgrade, that's good news. You'll remember that had been an airport we took over very recently. It's always great from the very start to see strong traffic growth, driven, of course, by our proactiveness in developing some new routes and so forth. All in all, last year we'll have managed 255 million passengers on all of our airports, which means that we're the number one airport operator. No doubt about it. We're the most diversified one, with 45 airports located in 12 different countries. Furthermore, we've been very active at Vinci Airports to develop new routes. Last year, we opened 325 new air routes, origins and destinations. This is one thing that's distinctive at Vinci Airports versus other similar players. We're highly proactive to develop new air routes where we know the airlines very well. And very interesting thing, out of the 325 new routes, 61 of them are long-haul routes, such as Osaka, London, and Santiago, Barcelona, that are very interesting for many different reasons. Managed revenue, which means taking 100% of the airports where we are in control or joint control with some partners. So managed revenue of Vinci Airports, 4.9 billion euros. This is an important figure. You have to compare this with the figure of Vinci Autoroutes, 5.6 billion on the previous slide. So we're not quite there yet, but slowly but surely, the proportion of Vinci Airports in terms of volume is managed starts to be comparable to the proportion we have in airports. we've seen a big increase in the figures, 2.6 billion for consolidated revenue. We see the impact of various things we did in recent years, such as the AWW airport groups in the portfolio, Belgrade, plus, of course, Gatwick, which is a big chunk of the increase in revenue there. So Vinci Airport continues to roll out its investments and innovation policy for all the stakeholders. There was also passengers who improve passenger experience and ease of transiting through airports. Also, focusing on airlines, helping them be more productive and efficient, also focusing on local governments and territories. That's also distinctive for us. We've got this true ability to work hand in hand as partners with all the various governments, local governments, through various arrangements, such as in Lyon, where we're also fortunate to have various local governments that are at our side, jointly investing in capital. Now, other concessions, mainly Vinci Railways and Vinci Highways. Other concessions continue developing well. For instance, growth of 6% in traffic. This is basically our assets in Greece. Next, strong growth in Lima, Peru, thanks to the opening of Section 2 of our urban motorway concession. Also growth, 8% growth, very interesting here. The first section of the Moscow-St. Petersburg, it was opened a few years ago with a traffic risk. Initially, the startup was a little bit difficult, but now it's on track. And as you also know, we opened sections 7 and 8. Limited liability schemes. These are terminals near St. Petersburg side, opened by President Putin a few weeks ago. Another highlight, confirmation of the success of our high-speed line. There had been a traffic risk there. The high-speed rail line, SEA, we've won the wager there. This is the second high-speed rail line that's the most used in France. Last year, we'll have carried around 20 million passengers on that line. Now to look more specifically and quickly at contracting business, starting with Vinci Energy. Vinci Energy gave us a record year. Solid organic growth, 6.5% in France, 4% outside of France. All in all, sees the full-year effect of acquisitions, fairly numerous, made in 2018, among others, the Prime Line deal in the United States, plus the beginning of effects from the 34 small and medium-sized acquisitions carried out in 2019, which aren't always reflected for the full year 2019. Nevertheless, they brought in extra revenue in the order of 300 million extra euros that should continue in 2020 for the full year effect. So no major operations such as we may have had in the U.S. last year, but a large quantity of what we call bolt-on acquisitions. Vinci Energy has been doing this type of acquisition for a fair few years now. An important highlight, renewed continuing growth in operating margin at Vinci Energy, now going beyond 6% EBIT margin. Another important point, international share at Vinci Energy. International business is 55% now versus 45% French activity. 2020 is looking good when we look at the quality and quantity of deals won in 2019 that'll be carried out in 2020. Now, the clear point is Vinci Energy is very fortunate to be well positioned in the two major areas, i.e. the digital resolution and energy transition. These are the main drivers for the virtuous growth at Vinci Energy. In a 10-year period, we'll have basically seen a threefold increase in the size of Vinci Energy, and we're convinced that things aren't over with yet. Eurovia, wonderful performance, particularly 8.5% organic growth in France. We'd expected this. We didn't expect it to be quite this strong. We see the pre-municipal elections, the run-up period. This is the usual effect. Regarding top line and revenue, it's the full year effect of acquisitions made in 2018, specifically TNT in Canada, as well as the plant and painting division from Lane Construction that I already mentioned earlier. Virtuous growth because at the same time, Eurovia is improving its EBIT margin, now going well beyond the 4% mark. Eurovia continues to develop internationally. 46% of its activity is international, the remainder in France. Like Vinci Energy, it had such good order intake in 2019 that we can feel 2020 should also be a very good year. In France, our thinking is it'd be a great thing if things were flat just after the municipal elections. Usually there's a sort of a downtick after municipal elections. That downtick this time shouldn't be as substantial as in previous election cycles. We think that things should remain fairly flat in France in 2020, which would be a good thing. Internationally, we'll continue to see growth. My feeling, I'll talk about it at the end of my talk, our feeling is that, yes, we'll continue to grow, but of course not at the same growth rates, identical growth rates as we had in 2019. Vinci Construction now. Vinci Construction also saw dynamic activity with good organic growth. We can see it on the slide. The strength, among other things, is supported by a ramp-up of the Paris region job sites, especially, not only, but especially thanks to the Grand Paris Express. Also very good activity in Central Europe, in the UK, in Asia, Oceania, and especially in Africa. I touched upon this earlier. Africa were there. It's resumed growth. Our Grand Projects division, you remember, it was sort of in a trough last year. We'd seen the completion of some major deals without having really secured new major deals. Now we have. We've won some new great contracts in the U.S., in Canada, in New Zealand, in the United Kingdom, which leads us to believe the Grand Projects division will resume growth in the next few months and years. Watch point continues to be the same one. Oil and gas activity. Oil is still very depressed. Not much capex available in the oil market. Much, much less than in previous years. Things are going fairly wellish in gas. We've made do. We won some pipeline deals in gas and liquefied natural gas, one in Canada, and also a deal, two new cryogenic reservoir tanks. Novatech, year from the year, we'd already built 4 cryogenic tanks built on permafrost. We negotiated directly with Novatech, the client, for 2 additional tanks, which will be a good thing in entrepose contracting. But entrepose contracting is in a fragile state for well-known reasons that have been discussed for quite some time. The overall market's very depressed. This is one of the explanations for the slight dip in our operating income for the entire construction division in 2019. The harvest of order intake, Vinci Construction 2019 was very good indeed, so we're confident in activity for 2020. 2 things to keep an eye on. First of all, activity in France. We want to make sure we're very aware of this. There are 2 main regions in France, main types of regions, those that are sort of overheating, and then other regions that are still lacking to some degree. So we mustn't just gauge France via the prism of the Greater Paris region. In the other regions, activity is somewhat fragile, and they have to be right-sized to take account of the local markets. That's the first watch point. Second thing to keep an eye on, we must continue working to improve our margins further in Vinci Construction. Now to talk about property, Vinci Immobilier, very good year. Vinci Immobilier, a year ago, I probably said that our thinking was we reached a peak in terms of reservations and sales of housing, and that things would start to go down slightly. There was no dip. We're basically at the same level of reservations and sales as in 2018. This is because, firstly, housing needs remain high in France. Furthermore, we're seeing continued low interest rates. Therefore, a lot of people sometimes have problems with the stock exchange. They decide to invest in property. Good activity as well if we look at business property, offices, and hotels, especially in Paris. There's a focus of things there, but also other major cities such as Lyon. Lastly, we talked about this probably already. Vinci Immobilier finalized in January 2019 the first stage in acquisition of the company called Urbat, which will position us in the south of the country, and also in a segment of property development which includes controlled housing units, controlled price housing units. I'll hand over to Christian now.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Well, good morning to you all. So, revenue, as we said, topped the 48 billion mark in 2019. That's a 10% increase, of which 5% in organic growth. It's the highest organic growth rate that we've achieved these past years. The last time dates back to 2011. It reached 6.4%. It's the same order on the slide between concessions and contracting. M&A, not talking, leaving aside Vinci real estate, up 20%, which is a consequence of apartment sales these past few years. There's a lag between the booking and the delivery of these apartments. M&A, 2 billion, give or take, additional revenue. That's about 400 million, the impact in 2019 of M&A in 2018. Primeline, Walloon, Vinci Energy, Belgrade, AWW, and some acquisitions by Eurovia, the first two in airports. The acquisition, 1.7 of the M&A deals in 2019 include a deal by Eurovia in the US, 2019, that of Lane for some 600 million additional revenue. Gatwick, 700 million consolidated since May 13 last year, and some 30 deals at Vinci Energy for revenue on the year of about 300 million. Full year Gatwick would have been close to 1 billion, and acquisitions by Vinci Energy about additional 800 million. We'll have those impacts going into 2020. Forex, slightly positive, the result of the slight decrease of the euro versus major currencies, US dollar, Canadian dollar, Swiss franc, or sterling. By geography, France, as you can see, growth was essentially organic, 6.1% out of a total of 6.2%. Very good formation finish of all our units. Vinci Airport 8.8, Vinci Energy plus 6.6, Vinci Autoroute plus 4.4, Vinci Construction 4.6, Vinci Real Estate up 19.3, International plus 16%, M&A accounts for over 10%, thanks to deals cited a moment ago. If we look by country, countries that grew the most in 19 are Belgium, Portugal, Czech Republic, Sweden, and Grand International, the US, Canada, Africa, Australia, New Zealand. So the share of France in this context, in spite of sustained activity, shrinks year after year, was slightly below 55% in 19. And moving back to 50 is a consequence of proactive expansion policy internationally. It needs to be flagged that outside Europe, we now achieve 18% of our revenues against 16% in 2018. That's 8.6 billion. No mean feat, and 8.6, 2.2 billion achieved in the US, our third largest international country after UK and Germany, topping 3 billion, then Canada with 1 billion. EBIT, it's up but close on 15%. That's a margin of 11.9% as against 11.5% last year. Let me say, because the question was put, IFRS 16 barely impacts these numbers, these trends. So the group's performance is remarkable. Almost all business lines have improved their contribution. It's the case for concessions, 560 million, up 16%, contracting 181 million, up 12%. In concessions, the growth comes from Vinci Autoroutes, up 280 million, Vinci Airport up 327 million. Of Vinci Autoroutes, the increase reflects the increase in revenue. And attractive, good cost control, favorable baseline effect with industrial action at the end of 18, and in insurance indemnity. I mentioned this when we disclosed the quarterlies that we obtained to partially offset the impact of the yellow vest. Vinci Airports, The increase incorporates Gatwick for some 270 million, the consequence of the traffic increase in Portugal and France, inter alia. Margin rate of Vinci Airport dipped slightly, but that's fully due to the different mix because every airport has its own specific features, and given applicable regulation, margin rates vary from one airport to another, from country to country. Particular Gatwick has a margin rate of 38.3%, 19, slightly below the previous rate of Vinci airports. That doesn't incorporate value creation expected across the various airports. Contracting, Vinci Energy, Xavier said, top 6%. That's an improvement if we calculate it down to the 1 cent of 25 BP, shows the ability of Vinci Energy to boost its profitability, not just in its historic units, and that answers comments made by some of you, its ability to successfully integrate in France and overseas new acquisitions. And furthermore, we had some M&A at Vinci Energy at EBIT rates above 6%, not to mention the value creation potential. Eurovia margin improvement exceeds 4.2%. Placing the unit at the high end of the industry, improved performance in France, Europe, and in America. The integration of lane plant and paving is going very well. In the US, we now achieve over 1 billion in revenue on the West Coast for Eurovia, making it one of the leaders in the area. America accounts 17% of Eurovia in 2019 as against 11% previously. Vinci Construction, slight dip in the margin. Let me say immediately, you probably doubt this, that this dip was far more marked in the H1, so it recovered while going into H2. Most of the units are posting good performance, with the exception, as Xavier said, of oil and gas, of entrepôts, but we've seen that it's set to recover in terms of its order book. We've brought some fine orders in. Good performance in the UK. Margin exceeds 2%, one of the best performance given the characteristics of the market over there. 3%, Soletange Freycinet up 4.4%. Major projects around 3%. We're at a low point, and that's going to correct soon with the new deals coming in. Only Vinci Construction France remains rather disappointing, below 2%, but if we compare the two halves, the derivative is now positive, and we hope that VCISF will improve its contribution in 2020. All in all, the unit's on the right track in retrieving its economic performance, and efforts undertaken should pay off as of this year. Decrease in the margin of Vinci Real Estate at 6% is due to the fact there's scarcity of land in France. It's getting difficult to find land. That's a raw material of real estate, whereas at the same time works costs tend to rise. Next slide gives you the income statement, starting with recurring operating income, where we see the impact of IFRS 2 share-based payments reflect in the accounts the impact of the incentive plans for our employees, share-based payments, be performance shares or the savings plan. I think Xavier will speak to that in a moment. We did a special transaction in December, paying a top-up of 400 euros to all our employees, so they become shareholders. They're all Vinci shareholders. That was 400 million. That accounts for part of the gap between the 2 years. We also need to mention in the positive, the upsides below, the contribution of our equity accounted affiliates has increased in Japan, Kansai, and Qatar. We booked some provisions last year, which didn't prove necessary once again this year. And the non-recurring items, there are various bits and pieces, nothing major, some goodwill impairments, but also some losses on disposals, but also some capital gains. Last year we had some upside. We had a positive impact, one-off on the reconsolidation of Xavier of the bridge in Greece. Now the financials that I still don't see on my screen, I hope you've got them. So the financial expense, 180 million, half is due to the increase in net financial expense. This increase in net financial expenses, of course, due to our M&A deals that need to be financed, and we incorporate in our numbers those of the targets. The case for Gatwick that has a debt of some 4 billion sterling, and Belgrade Airport. So if we add all these effects, it weighs on financial expense. Fortunately, we're able to optimize the cost of debt in euro, continued to decline in 19 through the various bond issues. More about that in a moment. 1.7% down to 1.3% on a weighted average basis, and we have fewer financial expenses capitalized on our current investments because the second section of the Lima autoroute was delivered last year, so we don't capitalize the financial expense on that investment. We still do it on the Strasbourg Ring Road, purely non-cash on discounting provisions. When rates decrease, provisions must be adjusted, and that's an expense in the P&L. Next, tax expense. Taxes up from 1.4 to 1.6 billion. That's as it should be, given the hike in the bottom line. The rate has increased from 32 to 33.8, primarily due to the fact that in 18 we benefited still from the tax credit. The competitive and labor tax credit is a tax credit, is non-taxable by definition, and the CIC was replaced with the same amount by a reduction of payroll taxes on low wages, which subject to tax. So there's an increase both in the amount and the tax rate stemming from that. All in all, it's worth stating, we sometimes tend to forget this. Vinci pays in France under corporate tax 1.2 billion, to which we must add about the same amount in various taxes that are included in EBIT, giving us about 2.3 billion in taxes paid by Vinci. We could add VAT on our French activities, 5.3 billion, and payroll taxes. That's about 8 billion that Vinci contributes to the economy and the finances of the French state. Net income's close to 3.3 billion. That's an increase of some 9%, to be found fully in the EPS because we eliminated all dilution by buying shares on the par with those that we create. So it's a year, I think, that's pretty commendable, if not very good. Let's look at the free cash flow. This chart that you all know explains the variation in the financial debt year on year, up 6.1 billion. The highlight this year is the level of free cash flow, defined as being EBITDA corrected for changes in working capital requirement, current provisions, financial expenses, tax, capex, be they current or non-current. For the first time we exceed the 4 billion mark. Last year I think we were at 3.2 billion, so 1 billion euro free cash flow over and above last year, which was beyond what we'd expected. So EBITDA 8.5 million. There's a star missing on the slide because we put a star next to capex, not next to EBITDA. In 8.5 there's an IFRS 16, the integration of leases in our accounts. We increase EBITDA and we have capex that offset that hike to the tune of 575 million. If we correct that effect, the increase of EBITDA is close to 15% versus last year. And if we correct still further the Gatwick impact, integration of Gatwick in this figure, we have an EBITDA increase close on 10%, which is pretty good, with an EBITDA excluding IFRS 16, that comes at 16.5% on revenue. 2/3 of EBITDA generated by concessions. That's 5.8 billion. Vinci Autoroute 4.2. Vinci Airport 1.5, and other concessions just under 200 million. Contracting and real estate contribute over 2.5 billion group EBITDA. Vinci Energy 1.1 billion Eurovia, and Vinci Construction close on 700 million each. Other good news is the change in working capital requirement, including current provisions, which is income of over 400 million, whereas last year we spent, and so that's an improvement of the year of some 700 million. So it's improvement to be found above all in contracting. Contracting approved at WCR by almost 900 million, whereas concession, essentially real estate, posted decrease. Real estate, major land acquisitions undertaken in 19. At the end of the year, we bought a building for 100 million euros, a building that we revamped and that we're going to resell immediately. Taxes, financial expenses up for what's disbursed by 300 million. In January 2018, we cashed in 120 under the partial reimbursement of the tax on dividends. We received part in 17, the balance in 2019. The figure was flat in 18. That contributes to the gap, 300 million. CapEx, 2.9 billion, but if for leases, actually 2.3 billion, up by 350 million euros on that 350 million increase. Half stems from the integration of Gatwick CapEx. Gatwick's not a concession, but full ownership. The Gatwick CapEx fall under that item. Investments by our concessions, close on 1.1 billion, 800 million for Vinci Highways, the Strasbourg Ring Road for over 200 million, the Vinci Airports, primarily in Brazil, mentioned by Xavier, the new Salvador terminal, and 40 million Cambodia, 40 in Portugal. So free cash flow, 4.2 billion, 1 billion more than last year. Next. Increase of free cash flow, 1 billion. Vinci Energy, 300 million. Vinci Concessions, 360. Good formation finish, explaining the increase in free cash flow. New acquisition, 7.7 billion. Gatwick out of 8.3. The balance actually deals by Vinci Energy that I mentioned earlier, and then dividend, not much to add. Share buybacks, I mentioned those, all that leading to debt up less than expect at 21.7 billion. Next slide, we compare the use net income group share with free cash flow. We can talk about the way of doing crunching the numbers. Not everyone does the same calculation. Here we've done it the same way over the past 5 years to show the trend. Good trend for the past 3 years and way above the 100% market. Next slide, balance sheet. So obviously major developments in 2019 reflected in capital employed. Pure coincidence of the number topping 50 billion as against 38.3 last year, with a major impact by Gatwick, but also other investments made by concessions units, equity up by 3 billion, and debt, as we saw, up 6%. This debt split between debt of 23 billion, up 7.2 billion, and managed cash of 1.4 billion, up over last year. And the 6.8, 4.2 billion are managed centrally at the holding company. And there was cash in foreign affiliates at the end of December. They weren't pushed up to the holding, so the case at Vinci SA holding tops the 4.2 billion marks. Next slide, financial policy. We're extremely active in 19, the first part of the year on the bond markets, raising 4.6 billion new debt, average maturity of 12 years, longer than what we did previously, average cost barely above 2% after hedging. So these funds benefited from very favorable market context facilitated by our credit rating shown on the left. Outlook positive at S&P. One day they may decide to upgrade us, we'll see. At the same time, we reimbursed long-standing loans costing us far more, 1.5 billion at 5%. Next, optimization of average cost of debt. We managed to reduce it year after year. This year it's not quite the case, but almost, in spite of the fact that on the one hand we had to go into debt and currency for our M&A deals in the US and the UK, but we integrated the cost of debt of our targets, notably that at Gatwick. Gatwick was already borrowing 4 billion in sterling at a cost that was markedly higher, which Vinci can access. That's reflected in the charts below, because up until the 2018, the bulk of our debt was in euros. It's now only less than 60% in euros. Obviously, a euro is the cheapest. Other currencies cost more. In spite of that, we have a cost of debt that remains pretty almost flat. And lastly, to end, fixed rates, floating, variable rates. I won't rehearse the explanations I give you every time. This is how we've been able to drive down our cost of debt year after year. We keep some of our gross debt at floating rate. It's a little less marked at the end of 19 than previously. It's partly due to the fact that we set part of our debt at 1 year debt. So in fact, it's fixed floating, it's short-term fixed rate, but we stick to the principle that we set the part of our debt that matches our cash surpluses, because they're invested short-term. We also try to have at floating rate the equivalent of a year's EBITDA. That's how we arrive at these charts, which over time have proved to be a good strategy, even if we challenge it. Nothing set in stone, and we rediscuss it regularly amongst ourselves with the financial teams. Thank you.
C'est sûr? Parce que on trouvait ça plutôt sympa.
Yes, that's good. Let me just wrap up and talk to you briefly about corporate social and environmental responsibility. 2020 in contracting. We have to look at the order book, and we'll see here, that's also not customary, fairly unusual, increase in the order book by 10%. That's thanks to the 2019 harvest of order intake. This is true in all of our business lines, and it's also true in all of our geographies. Everything up. It's not like that every single year. Please look at the slide again, put the slide again, seeing the uptick everywhere. The effect of this is growth in contracting business in 2020. Of course, growth rates won't be as strong as those observed in 2019. In concessions, still always very difficult to predict. We think motorway traffic should grow in line with economic growth, assuming there aren't further unforeseen events that could disturb that correlation between economic growth and traffic growth for motorways. Also growth at Vinci airports, but the comparison base is now very high, so the growth will be less than in 2019. There's a question mark, of course, not as strong for us as for others. Nonetheless, there's a question mark. Necessarily, there will, to some degree, be an impact. Here I'm thinking of the impact of the coronavirus. Briefly, to come in on that point, if we tally up Chinese travelers that transit through our airports, we're talking about a proportion of around 5.5%. 5.5% of our 255 million passengers are going to or coming from China. It's important, as a sizable figure, but a smallish proportion. Mainly, these travelers are transiting through Cambodia, where a large portion of Chinese travelers there, and also Japan. A lot of Chinese tourists going to Japan. When I say China, I'm also including Hong Kong and Macau. Since nobody can predict coronavirus will evolve. So it would be early days now, too early to do any actual forecasting for the time being. We can't quantify anything except that in our businesses, fairly a modest impact for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we're almost not active at all in China in contracting business. We have very low dependence on China in terms of sourcing materials, supplies, and the airport figures I've just given you. For all these reasons, we believe that all in all, at Vinci in 2020, we should see growth in revenue again and growth in net income. With all this data in mind, the Board of Directors met yesterday and decided to submit to the next shareholders meeting a resolution on paying a dividend of 3.05 euros per share. 0.79 was already paid in November of 2019. You'll observe this is an increase of 14% versus the dividend last year. Inter alia, because the payout ratio, which generally was around 50%, has gone up slightly to reach 52.5%. I wanted to make last couple of points. We all have to get accustomed to this. And I wanted to wrap up by saying this: our economic results aren't the only thing this is about. For quite some time, we've felt we have to look at overall performance, comprehensive performance. We've got this outlined in our manifesto now, which is summarized on the slide. This is to be seen in all of our offices, at all our concessions, all of our production sites, in all geographies. This is a summary of what we feel is comprehensive overall performance. The good news is we're making progress in all of these areas. In the area of safety, currently 72% of our business units did not have any accident with lost time in 2019. We've reduced, which we've done for many years now, the frequency rate, which is one way of measuring our efforts in the area of training, organization, design, enhancing job site safety. So we've made progress in safety. We've also made progress in the area of diversity, especially gender diversity. Our target is in the short term to bring up to 25% the proportion of female managers in our global geographies. The difficulty is we're starting from a very low proportion for various historic and cultural reasons in our various business lines, so it's not easy. But I just, without diving into detail, wanted to say we are tackling this subject in a very determined fashion. We're also making progress in the area of sharing the benefits of our good performance. If you calculate everything we pay out, different products, different systems of profit sharing, different employee profit sharing systems, various collective profit sharing systems for employees, and for also taking into account everything we propose to our employees via employee shareholder plan, Castor, which has been rolled out, and 90% of our employees are eligible for this globally. Taking into account all that, plus some additional top-up pensions for some of our employees, such as the low earners, we end up with a figure which is significant, i.e., 470 million euros we fund in one way or another through these various arrangements to our employees. We're also making progress in another area where we're already well established. It's well established in our corporate culture. Societal responsibility. What we're proudest of in 2019 is the successful launch, and this will be an ongoing endeavor, of an operation we're calling Give Me 5. Every year, Give Me 5 enables us to welcome 5,000 youngsters, high schoolers, all of them coming from priority education areas. Throughout France, we've focused on around 10 priority education areas in France. In each of these areas, every year, we take 500 high schoolers and they get a 1-week internship, a strong focus on learning, where they discover what the business world's all about. They discover business lines. We show them accountants, people in communication, people in production, workers, supervisors, managers, and so forth. So they discover, often for the very first time, these various points in a company. That's part of our societal responsibility, to go find these youngsters where they are in locations where they don't have a personal network, enabling them to access this type of information and gain this type of experience, which will be fundamental for them to build their lives. This has been very successful. This year, we'll reach our target of 5,000 youngsters. That's an enormous figure. We're really rolling out this program for high schoolers and middle schoolers. Our target is to accommodate 5,000 of them every year. There are other components in this Give Me 5 program. There's one chapter which seems fairly simple but isn't. And this is the idea that we're also bringing in for summer jobs, summertime jobs, and internships. At least 20% of these interns will be coming from these priority education areas, these difficult neighborhoods. People who are studying and who live in these priority education areas are people who don't have an actual network at their fingertips. So we need to assist these people so that they can come into companies such as ours. Previously, we hadn't done this. Our summer jobs and our interns came by word of mouth, but we tended to bring in people from various other areas. Now we're setting aside some of our internships and summer jobs for these specific priority education areas, these underprivileged areas. In 2019, I mentioned this earlier, we worked very hard on environmental topics. 3 important topics here we focused on. A couple very important that worked on a great deal pertaining to CO2 emissions, and then also the circular economy, which is central focus for us. And then a third point is biodiversity, water, and natural environments. To focus on the environment, this is the topic you can summarize most easily. We've done in-depth work, very in-depth work with all of our teams. Now we can take a commitment. We stated this a few weeks ago, to cut by 40% our CO2 emissions under the scopes we're in control of, the scopes 1 and 2. The timeline here is 2030. The good news is that if you just look at existing technology, today's technology, if we just set up the existing equipment that's available off the shelf from our suppliers today, if we implemented all of this in a very assertive way, a very ambitious way between now and 2030, we'd already reduce CO2 emissions by 30%. We want to go even further. So we've taken a commitment to bring it down by 40%. We're convinced that our own R&D and the R&D of our suppliers and partners will enable us to reach the target of reducing CO2 emissions by 40%. Now, 40% by 2030. That's on the trajectory that brings us to carbon neutrality by 2050. That's trajectory of COP21, which means limiting global warming by down to under 2 degrees by the end of the century. The other piece of good news, once we've achieved all of this, once this has all been done, there are various actions enabling us to reach the minus 30, which are now available today off the shelf from our suppliers and partners. If we achieve this, if we do this, the actual figures here, we're talking about fairly significant capex, but we've first got the resources for this. Of course, there are winning lines and some losing lines, but all in all, it's win-win. This is very important. I'm convinced. The topic of the environment, we know this, is gaining speed at a dizzying pace. We're going to have to be constantly thinking about global performance, overall performance. It's not just technical economic performance on one side and environmental, societal, and social performance on the other side. We're just talking about comprehensive overall global performance, or there's no performance at all. When we're talking about the environment, we won't achieve this if it's separated from economics. So the good news in the survey we did in 2019 was that we've demonstrated that, yes, it is possible to pull together what we need, have environmental performance and economic performance going hand in hand, and that's not said often enough. We need to say it. There are far too many people who are convinced that saving the planet will mean negative growth. That's not true. Saving the planet will mean finding the resources to ensure that both concerns, environmental concerns and economic concerns, go together, hand in hand, or focused on at the same time. Otherwise, we've seen episodes such as the Yellow Vest. There'll be social problems and unrest, and that would bring to the end our beautiful economies. So it's very important. We'll be talking about this more and more. It's wonderful. We think it's tremendous. This has been an extraordinary opportunity to revisit the way we do things, our processes, the way we design things. Now, of course, we're not only focusing on the scope we're in control of, scopes 1 and 2, but we're also very aware that due to our size and our strong presence throughout the value chain are such that we have to play a role as a leader in this area to bring along with others with us. Scope 3, upstream, our suppliers, and also Scope 3, downstream. When Vinci Autoroute rolls out networks of electric recharging stations, maybe hydrogen in the future, throughout its network, Scope 3, upstream, that's when Vinci Construction develops low-carbon or ultra-low-carbon concrete formulas. Ultra-low-carbon concrete means 64% CO2 emissions reduction versus usual concrete production. We use a great deal of concrete, so we are a leader in this area. We can influence others. We can speed up factoring in this requirement to reduce CO2 emissions by the concrete manufacturers and cement makers. So we've got responsibilities in scopes 1 and 2, but a major responsibility to be driving force on the scopes 3 and 4, up and downstream. We love this. It's very exciting. It's an opportunity to review all of our processes, where we do everything. Essentially, Vinci, though some people, I'm joking, but since Vinci is mainly full of technical people, lots of engineers, as soon as there's a new subject, a major subject like this one is, relating to the environment, we think this is a blessing. We think it's very exciting to get down to work on it. We'd like to field your questions now.
Christophe à droite, comme d'habitude, à la première.
Christophe to the right, we'll get the first question as usual.
Micro. Juste là au milieu. Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. So 3 questions. The first, I'd like to return to slide 68 on the CapEx forecast for Vinci Highway. Second, question on Vinci Airports. Thirdly, question on Vinci Construction France. On Vinci Construction France, it was said that the operating margin was slightly below 2%. Is that reflect an improvement over last year? Does it incorporate the claims proceeds, some sensitive job sites that were losing money? Where are we at in the Greater Paris on the awards for 16 and 17? 15 and 18, you mean? On the forecast on slide 68, as compared to the slide shown last year by Vinci during the annual result, we had motorway CapEx forecasts that were slightly higher. Were there problems with the negotiation of the stimulus plan? Vinci Airports ANA contributed strongly to the growth of late. Is seeing an asymptote on its EBITDA, 65%, not very different of last year. Can we expect an improvement for Portuguese airports and possibly operating income for Vinci for ANA? You're really at the cutting edge there. Jean-Christophe has done his homework. On VCF, income 2019 is better than it was previous years. It's better secured. So we're now well placed to begin to ensure it flourishes. The problems of the past are rather behind us. Doesn't mean they've all gone, because in this business there are always some, but the worst is behind us. And that's built in terms of performance and conditions that are more robust than in previous years. On the Greater Paris, Jerome, Do you want to add something on Vinci, on VCISF, Vinci Construction France? Hi, so on Greater Paris, there were no significant awards of construction at Greater Paris in 18 award on line 18-1. That's set to happen in the first half. We continue to respond to call for bids for segment 18-2, and we're gearing up for the subsequent segments that will be up for bids this year, for which we'll get a response in 21-22, that are the first major lots of line 15 West. Airports, yes, Nicolas. Well, briefly, as you mentioned, the EBITDA margin has risen a lot these past few years, plus the volume effect. There are two items. There's a key item, an increase in the minimum wage, a general kind of sharing of a number of growth benefits, hinging on subcontract. I mean, that's not shocking. There are a number of services that are up slightly. More importantly, as you see, we're in a phase of modeling. There are also additional design survey costs for the two projects, improving the capacity of the existing airport and preparing for the new airport of Montijo, which, as we saw, Xavier said, was approved from the environmental standpoint and is now to be subject to the implementation of the MOU that we signed last year. It's no longer really a priority to continue this very significant growth phase, notably in Lisbon. I didn't understand the question on the auto routes on the highway, says Mr. Huillard. Did you understand the question? You didn't understand it, but you'll try and answer it nevertheless. No. We've just had a study group on this. We didn't actually understand this because the three drivers of the level of motorway capex as presented last year and this year. It's the motorway stimulus plan for the Strasbourg by road, and there are no changes, at least no reduction. So I have to find last year's paper to answer you. So it's more a phasing of sequencing. No further questions. Let's take questions over the phone. So for questions over the phone, please dial 1. First question from JP Morgan, you have the floor. Okay, we'll finish the questions in the room.
Monsieur Barclay, j'avais une question sur le BFR et une question.
WCR question, and then a question in a country you mentioned is more and more important, bigger and bigger for you, the U.S. With WCR first, positive flow this year. We hadn't had that in the last 3 years. I understood in construction activities this had a positive impact on cash flow when there was growth. So two questions. Any non-recurring in 2019, or was it due to previous years that have been fairly atypical? How do you view things then in 2020 in this respect? Second question has to do with the United States. Energy, Eurovia did fairly big-sized acquisitions in the U.S. there. What about construction? Would that be meaningful? Secondly, you specified that now your size, your market coverage is fairly good in the southwest of the U.S. We talk a lot about opportunities, for instance, in Maryland. Would you consider this? Remember, out of the 38 billion in our contracting business, construction makes up 15. WCR versus growth phenomena go in other direction, usually in other business lines, which is to say, part of Vinci construction activity, particularly general contracting, has negative WCR requirements. Well, not negative, well, positive WCR requirements. So when they grow, generally that improves WCR in theory. But another portion of construction, and Eurovia and Vinci Energy, of course, have genuine working capital requirements. So you've got to look at, do a fine-tuned analysis of growth. The United States now. There's no current project to do anything of significant size in the U.S. For a straightforward reason. The business of construction in the U.S. is a local business. Furthermore, it can be a fairly hazardous business, so it's not our intention to spend a great deal of money to acquire positions there. The plus would be maybe it's gaining root in a given state, but not necessarily in neighboring states. That ties in with the third question. When we respond to concession deals in the United States, we absolutely have to be able to make sure that our contracting activities can be brought into the loop, not necessarily active alone, but have to be active. It would be risky in the U.S. to be fully dependent on an outside constructor. That could be problematic. When you're in a portion of the U.S., one corner of the U.S., you're not necessarily deemed legitimate to be active elsewhere in the U.S. You don't necessarily have a full enough understanding of the local ecosystems of suppliers, subcontractors, are they unionized, are they non-unionized, and so forth. The country is a whole mosaic of regulations and business ecosystems that are quite different from each other. That brings me to a third point, Eurovia's strategy. Pierre Angelas will correct if mistaken. The strategy is to really say that we win when we've got a more dense coverage. That's how we took over lane activities. We were present in that portion of the U.S., east, southeast. So we moved on that opportunity to add to our density of presence there. It may be counterintuitive. The temptation of a lot of people is to plant their flags every which way in a country. It's not successful in this business line. It's better to get a more dense coverage where you already exist rather than give in to the temptation to plant your flag all over the country. It's not always true in all business lines. Sorry, I'm not going to go into greater detail. One part of Vinci Construction can see external growth, but it's not big figures involved here. They could develop everywhere. I'm thinking of the high added value technical Vinci Construction, which is Sol Étanche Freycinet. Would you like to add a point? Is that okay? WFR? WCR? Microphone is on. On working capital requirements, to answer your question, there's no non-recurring item to point out specifically. It's just that we recovered some of the income that we'd lost, so to speak, over time in various previous fiscal periods and job sites in France, particularly. Then we got a negative impact the other way around, which is developing business in activity. Developing an activity requires WCR, but it's good WCR. Payment times take longer than in Africa than elsewhere. Thank you. We have a question. Hello, Virginie Rousseau from Odo. I've got 3 questions. The first one on Eurovia. Margin growing in 2019, but it seems to me it's down in the second half versus second half of 2018. Can you explain that? Second question. I'd like to know about the impact of China and Vinci airports. I heard the percentage of Chinese passengers. Is there a different proportion in revenues if you take into account the fact that Chinese spend more in retail? A last question, payout, 52.5%. Can we consider this as now normative? Can we expect an improvement or return to 50%?
I'll let my colleagues respond to the first 2 points on the payout by Christian. We've always said that the payout rule of 50% introduced when we acquired ASF back in 2006 factored in the makeup of our business portfolio at the time, less concessions and more contracting than today. So as we developed concessions business, it was natural to consider a slightly higher payout because people who are pure players in concessions generally have payout ratios above 50%. We're beginning to make a step forward, so normally we shouldn't backtrack, but if we continue to successfully deploy our concessions business, it might not be the last step we take. Right, Christian? Well, you decide. But that's the explanation, right? Yeah, I don't find your figures on Eurovia. I don't see a deterioration in EBIT in H2, and if there was one, it would be, there's nothing significant. That's not. Eurovia H1 generally is disrupted by weather conditions. I don't see any reason. These aren't things that I look. I'm a bit surprised by the question. I don't see any material reason for any lags, if only maybe possible impact of weather conditions, but then it needs to be looked at by geography because, of course, it varies. Christian saying it's not what I have. We're talking about operating. It's up in absolute terms and in percentage. If you talk about net income, there may be other factors, goodwill impairments, disposal capital gains, but for the EBIT, it's up. We'll check, says Xavier. So Chinese passengers, the volume is only 5.5%. In response to your question, we do calculate passengers without Japan, 9 million passengers. We have a retention rate of only 40%. Extra air, they probably spend more, but in our accounts it's less because only 40% rate, and it's non-consolidated in Cambodia. We have 4.5 million of Chinese passenger there. The rate is 70% higher, but they spend less than the average. That's why detailed calculations are less significant, represent about 5.5%, that it's long-term, good quality traffic because it grows faster than the average over the mid-long term, but one-off part of that traffic, we don't know the duration, will be perhaps more impacted this year. It's just over 5% of our total traffic level. That's where it's interesting to really look at the long-term perspective and the crisis that we're experiencing today. There'll be others before the end of the concession. What's important is to manage them with great flexibility, whilst bearing in mind that once the crisis over, things go back to normal because we have this long time horizon. Next question.
Oui. Oui, merci. Eric.
Thank you. Yes, I've got 3 quick questions. First of all, could you update us on possible negotiations on the Notre-Dame-des-Landes concession contract and possible compensation that you might negotiate for yourselves? Second question. Last year, you mentioned more difficult relations with your clients, with pending concession contracts and negotiating possible adjustments that would be required. I'd like to know about the relationships. Have things calmed down now, or are you still observing tension with clients on these subjects? And then one last question, and third and last question. Could you give us your feeling on changes in operating margin in all the contracting businesses in 2020? I'll let Nicolas answer on Notre-Dame-des-Landes. I said that last year about clients, relations with clients that maybe were slightly more tense. I was thinking of contracting, if you recall. Not concessions, which you just mentioned, which isn't to say things are easy in concessions, but that's what I was talking about at the time. I was talking about contracting. Let me put it this way, though. I would say things haven't really improved or worsened. It's still sort of a sporting event, and we have to be very careful in managing the contracts. We're probably not the very best in France in contract management. Some well-known competitors are a bit ahead of us. We probably need to be a little bit more clever in our contractual abilities. We're not just talking about carefully reading the contracts and making best use of all clauses in contracts. We're talking about having excellent traceability of any and all events that necessarily impact, disturb in some way, job site. But to keep track of everything so that we can then have reasoning. And we also need to deal with the matters as they arise and not just postpone them, brush them under the carpet, and await the end of the contract. So it's we're learning as we move forward and we adapt. Margins. Well, honestly speaking, Arnaud Grisson, in charge of Vessel Energy, do you want me to ask for another increase in margin in the short term? No. Maybe one day. But he made a beautiful effort. We asked him politely last year. So we'll let him have a little breathing space now. Eurovia, maybe, could be pressured slightly. Construction, yes, definitely. So overall margin of Vinci Construction should go up in 2020. Regarding Notre-Dame-des-Landes, Nicolas, briefly, over 9 years, we've worked very hard to execute the contract. No doubt about it. Traffic went from 3 million to 7.2 million passengers. This was the strongest traffic growth in France. We've got surveys showing GDP. There wasn't a direct relationship. There wasn't a direct link with Nantes, Italy, and Spain. They've been created this way. We continue cancellation at the earliest will be end of 2021. Awarding a new contract. We've got ongoing investments, smallish things, parking areas, and so forth. With Eurovia, we're doing the extension of the Saint-Nazaire airport, which helps Airbus because the XL can land there now, and this generates jobs as well. We're asking for dialogue now. This is the right time to have discussions, to calculate compensation for cancellation. Under administrative law in France, this depends on the value created, the lost amount, and so forth. A fairly complex calculation, 45 years worth of contracts that are removed from us. So discussions are possible. They're not easy discussions. You take one single figure, but ways and means of discussing. You have to forecast growth and so forth. So we would like to be actively involved in a discussion with the government on this.
Okay.
Muriel
Felous from MF Research. I was wondering, would it be possible to optimize cost of debt for Gatwick, and what might the timeline be to do that? Then I've got a second question. This has to do with external growth. Are there geographies or business lines? We have some knowledge already, but do you have any additional new information on possible external growth? And then I got a last question. Elections and roadways. Why in 2020 do you think there won't be as much of an impact from the municipal elections versus how things are usually? First of all, Christian, Gatwick, it's a shared interest in the two shareholders, JP and Vinci airports, to optimize to the degree possible cost of debt and optimize everything else as well. We've got a great team. I'll be meeting with others next week, such as people in the finance department. They issued, I think, for 30 years. That was July of 2019. I don't remember the rate, but it was pretty good, under 3%. So they're true top professionals. Optimization will take place because rates will tend to remain low and very low. As you refinance existing debt, we'll be able to optimize. We have joint discussions with people from Gatwick, people from Central Treasury, but these are highly professional people. We can optimize the acquisition debt. We've begun doing this. We'll continue to do so. That's my answer. What about the elections question on this? It's always difficult to forecast the future, but we do not expect a major drop in public works activity in France during the municipal elections year of 2020. Usually, it's counter-cyclical during municipal elections. Let me explain the reason. If you look at the long track record, things can fluctuate. In 2014, there was a double-digit drop. If you look back farther, on average, it's less of a drop. There can be some very big drops and then some lower drops during election years. Now, another point of election cycles, there's another cycle of elections. This will go the other way around. Next year will be departmental elections in the département. Now, the proportion of public contracting, public works is lower there than for local governments, municipal governments. There can be an impact. Then a third point. There are some more structural current effects. Firstly, local governments have fairly good finances right now, boosted inter alia by proceeds from property taxes. Furthermore, and this is a real difference versus 2014, all the various shared structures that were being set up in 2014, shared by municipalities, are up and running. Twofold effect. 2014, our clients were getting reorganized, banding together, and so forth, and during that period, they weren't launching projects, not many. So that's a positive baseline effect. Furthermore, there are various projects in these urban areas that are long-term projects with structures that are less sensitive to political changes. That's the various reasons involved. Plus, we're starting the year with great momentum, thanks to the order book at Eurovia, where business is fairly cyclical. The beginning of the year is going to be quite active, since they've got orders on hand. External growth, this will vary from business line, but an overall answer would be in contracting businesses, what we're convinced of is we can't just buy something because it's a beautiful company. We acquire it if, first of all, we've worked hard to get a full understanding of their corporate culture and the culture and habits of the country we're going to buy in. So we can't just develop every which where. So every business line has some priority geographies. For instance, you've observed Eurovia really likes Canada and the U.S. This could extend to further geographies in the future. For the time being, that's the focus, trying to get greater density of our activities in those areas of the world. Eurovia won't be going to China or elsewhere in Asia. Vinci Energy is make the same point. They did a first significant development through in the United States. The Prime Line, we're in the integration process. This might take a few more years. Once that's complete, we can use Prime Line to possibly roll out other Vinci Energy expertise in that area of the world. So we're doing this step by step. The rationale isn't exactly the same as for concessions. Concessions, especially airports, here our policy is we study 360 degrees. We look at everything. We try to be very proactive, forward-looking, and we're then able to go to many geographies, assuming these geographies are secure in terms of legal and political stability, and assuming they're geographies that aren't ethically problematic.
Voilà. On va prendre, si vous voulez, on va prendre au téléphone.
Questions over the phone now, please.
Nous avions une question de Madame Elodie Roll. Madame, c'est à vous.
We have a question over the phone, please.
Oui, bonjour.
Yes. Okay, so it's my turn. I have three quick ones. Cambodia. I understand there's a new airport being built at Phnom Penh, set to be completed in 2023. Is there going to be an overlap there with your activities in Cambodia? Secondly, AMSAC, is there a date on the dispute? But thirdly, you seem more confident on Vinci construction margins. When you're going to hit the 4% margin for Vinci construction? Yes, Nicolas for Cambodia. Well, Cambodia is a country where for several years now, in several places, there are plans that are moving forward, they're evolving. The date that you mentioned seems very soon. Next, unfortunate, I'd say, is what's happening today in Cambodia is the stoppage, discontinuation of relations with China, difficulty to get engineers, materials. So it's really not the topic of the day, Cambodia. It's really just to address the situation for an economy that remains rather weak, a shock which at macro level could be quite significant. We're going to help it because in the welcome at Cambodian airports we have all necessary measures, technical, health, to ensure the activity lasts. We don't know what's going to happen in the next few years, but there's nothing imminent or looming, and in the meantime we're facing up to strong recent growth. We're extending the runway at Sihanouk with Minar and Vinci construction earthworks. The airport's grown over 100% last year. On Lamsac, it's going to be long-term effort. That's to say, this type of dispute that you're referring to takes time. The good news is that the contract execution continues. It's our duty as a concessionaire. The second section has been put in service. The traffic is there. We're playing on. It's international arbitration that will take several years, and for which we're obviously vigilant, and we're following the case. But there's no particular worries aside from the fact it takes time. But we continue to operate as concessionaire. On the construction margin, it's going to happen in a few years' time. In answer to your question. Thank you. Next questions over the phone.
Nous avons une prochaine question de Madame Stéphanie Datz. Madame, c'est à vous.
Yes, please. My first question, if I may, on motorway traffic, you ended the year up 2.8% at group level versus PRR at plus 1.1. Can you explain what the reasons for this outperformance versus 2020 traffic? You say that you're going to slow rate growth. Can we expect to have as much as the growth in France? Second question on airport traffic levels. Given the limited capacity of ANA, can we expect a major slowdown in traffic levels in 2020 at Gatwick? Given the Brexit and the growth level in 2019, can you tell us what your outlook is for 2020? Final question here, the percentage of your order book going to the local government municipalities. Thanks. Yeah, traffic versus APRR, traffic versus APRR. I think we have a better baseline effect, yellow vest that is, at the end of 2018 and early 2019 than APRR, and so we're benefiting from that. Contrary to the baseline effect. Second thing is clearly Franco-Spanish trade is better than Franco-German trade, then ASF is better than APRR, at least benefiting from that effect. And as to trend going into 2020 is that it's confidential, but I know they converge in line with the economic growth, barring any unforeseen event. We can say that the year's off to a good start. On airports, yeah, well, the paradox, one-off paradox of airports, not long-term, is that very highly constrained airports can have strong growth rates to facilitate operation. Kate, at Nantes, highly constrained, 16.6% in 19. Also in Lisbon, where we had over 7%, if I recall, and there's a good trend. We're currently investing in the existing Lisbon airport on the runway to facilitate, in conjunction with Portuguese air traffic, that's also invested to optimize the number of short-term flights. I mean, there's additional capacity, new routes opening, but not the same level as the past, sometimes very high, double-digit, but there's still some scope. We're working the 3 years before the opening of a new airport to continue to optimize capacity. Question on the percentage of the municipality block. If I put the question to Pierre, he could perhaps respond for his question. For Jérôme, in your business, what's the share of Vinci construction that comes from local government? If you give a figure, it'd be what? 15% from the municipalities, yeah, a bit more, 20%, I'd say. And for you, Pierre, a third. So there, in summary, since you're not physically present, municipalities, that's about a third of French Eurovia business. At VCF, it represents 20% of the business of VCF. At Vinci Energy, I think it's pretty modest. So all in all, if we do the exact calculation that we never do, we'd be at best at 15% of total contracting. That's for France. No regrets? Time for refreshments. Thank you.